Hello, my name is Kimberly Pachowiak, and I'm the Protective Order Resource Attorney for the Texas Office of Court Administration. This presentation is about protective orders and the importance of TCIC reporting, the big picture. Protective orders are one of the few places in the criminal and civil justice systems where we can actually be proactive instead of reactive. Usually we're looking at punishing or sentencing for an incident that has already occurred. While protective orders do have to take into account prior incidents, the goal is to stop violence from escalating even more. And so the opportunity to have that is something that we need to make sure we're making the most of. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that they're getting entered properly into the TCI system so that officers can enforce them and verify them and then take the proper steps that they need to take. However, it is also important to keep in mind that no one part of the protective order process is the only thing. It's that it's about the whole big picture. It's about people working together no matter what our role is, and also keeping in mind that protective orders are a part of an even bigger picture involving safety planning, proper prosecution, proper advocacy on behalf of victims in order to keep them safer. So it is one part of the puzzle, but a very important part. That being said, in my prior career as a family violence prosecutor, my sense of humor is what kept me going and helped me keep my sanity. So there may be some times when we inject a little bit of humor into this presentation, but it is not at all to belittle the subject or the topic, because it is something that is very, very important to me. But it is something to kind of keep in mind that we do want to have a good sense of humor, because as Mark Twain said, the human race has one really effective weapon, and that is laughter. So unfortunately, when it comes to protective orders, some people just don't get it. Like this guy. He wants to know, what sort of flowers say, "I promise to obey the protective order"? So, and he's going to be the least that we want to worry about. The ones we have to worry about are the ones that no matter what, no judge, no officer, nobody is going to tell them that they can't be around the person that they want to be around and do whatever it is that they want to do. But we really can't have a conversation about that without talking about domestic violence dynamics. Because, when I say domestic violence, this is what many people think about. Remember this show? Yeah, usually involved a domestic disturbance. Maybe you can't really tell who the problem is. Everybody's yelling at everybody. Maybe both are violent toward each other. And unfortunately, that tends to be what people think about, the kind of the stereotypical domestic violence situation. However, that is kind of a common misconception about family violence incidents. Unfortunately, it's one that is widely held, and there's usually a lot more going on behind the scenes. So it's usually a lot more like this.
Where's dinner?
Well, I thought you'd be home a couple of hours ago, and I put everything away.
What is this? Pizza?
You had just called me. I would have known what
Dinner ready is pizza.
Honey, please don't be so loud. Please don't. Let go of me!
Get in the kitchen!
No!
Do you want to see what hurts? That's what hurts! That's what hurts!
Oh, please! Please!
For information, call 1-800-END-ABUSE.
So that is definitely a different perspective than from the first video. But it just helps to kind of keep those things in mind and some of the reasons we do what we need to do when it comes to family violence intervention. Which leads us to the why, what, who, and how of it all. Specifically, why do we care about protective orders and their entry into TCIC? Well, first of all, safety and accountability. Two big goals in domestic violence intervention, regardless of what your role is. Judge, attorney, law enforcement, advocate, probation officer, whatever it may be. Those are the two main goals that we always need to be thinking about with whatever it is that we're doing. And it's hard to talk about those things with also making sure we're talking about the prevalence of DV, the dynamics of DV, and also some of the barriers to reporting DV. And while we could easily spend a week on all of that without covering the whole thing, we're going to hit the high points to make sure that we remember why we need to do what we're doing. Secondly, we care because of funding impact. We all have funding streams, regardless of whether or not that comes directly from government funding, whether it becomes from fundraisers or anything else. We want to make sure that funding is being handled properly and that we are able to get whatever funding we need to provide the services that are desperately needed by victims of domestic violence and their families. So how this can affect funding is a big part of this. Research. The concept of garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have good information being put through the system and have that system bring us back good information that we can actually act on, it's not going to help us much. So we want to make sure that the information that we're gathering is useful and helps us make decisions regarding funding allocation, resource allocation, and those type of things. Second on the list is what, and that's going to be all the acronyms, the alphabet soup. What is NCIC, TCIC, and ICS, among others? We want to make sure we understand what those systems are, what they stand for, and basically what they do. So we will have an overview on that. The other what is what types of protective orders should they be getting entered into TCIC, and what type of protective orders in Texas do we have. So we'll cover that as well. The next one, who participates in the process? And let me tell you, there are a lot of people. A lot of people deal with these cases. A lot of people deal with the paperwork for protective orders, ultimately, which does affect the quality of the information that gets entered into TCIC. So we're going to talk about those different roles and what we can do to help each other in this process. And last but not least, how to improve the process. What kind of obstacles do some jurisdictions run into, and what are some of the best practices that we heard about and we want to share with everybody else? Some people had some great ideas. Some people were actually taking care of these ideas and doing these ideas. Some people were just talking about them or looking for ways to implement those ideas. And so we want to talk about those things as well. So that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the dynamics of domestic violence. So a general definition for domestic violence is that it is a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. And this definition comes to us from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And they're a wonderful resource. So if you are in a position where you need to give information and you don't really have a whole list of resources available in your community, this is a great place to start. The hotline number is 1-800-799-SAFE. Again, if you don't have any other information and you want to give someone this number, they will be able to get a lot of great information in their community about the help that they need. And also their website is www.thehotline.org. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, back to the pattern. It includes actions or threats of actions that are physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological. It's really important to keep in mind that the first two on this list, physical and sexual, those are pretty much the only ones that would ever come into play in the criminal or civil justice systems. But the rest of these, emotional, economic, and psychological, are kind of the glue that holds all of that together. And it's some of those things that happen, and oftentimes those are the things that are happening behind the scenes that really shores up the fear and the threats that victims go through that causes them to determine that they are not going to be able to handle this on their own, or that they keep trying to handle it on their own because they're scared to get that other person in trouble. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Because, there is a situation where people think, well, okay, nothing happened before. This is just out of the blue, domestic violence, homicide. However, as Casey Gwynn, who is the president of the National Family Justice Center Alliance, said, no relationship goes from happy, healthy, and functional to murder-suicide overnight. It never happens that way. There is always a pattern of abuse. And that has been my experience as well. Casey was the city attorney in San Diego, California, back in the 90s. Later on, he became the president of the National Family Justice Center Alliance because what had happened in San Diego, he and his team got together and had the first Family Justice Center, and that was before there was a national initiative to do so. And ultimately, the national initiative that awarded many grants to many jurisdictions across the country and now all over the world, pattern this initiative after what they did in San Diego to make it a one-stop shop that a victim of domestic violence can go there, not only apply for protective orders, talk to detectives and prosecutors, talk to counselors, get referred for health care, transportation, maybe job training, all different kinds of things, all in one place. Because it's really hard for victims in this situation to be able to maintain a normal life, trying to keep a job and keep up with their kids and keep them in school doing what they need to do, and then have to travel all over the city or the county to find the help that they need. And so that's basically what the Justice Center does. But he has a lot of really good insights based upon his many years of handling family violence prosecution to know that, yes, there is always a pattern of abuse. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen this before. This is the power and control wheel, and it is a really important tool that came into being many, many years ago from a project out of Duluth, Minnesota. And it was based upon interviews with victims of domestic violence, asking what are some of the things that are happening that are keeping you from being able to either leave the relationship, do what you need to do to take care of yourself and your family. And so these responses are things that came out over and over and over. So they were able to put together this tool because it really does show kind of the full picture. As you can see on the outside is the physical and sexual violence, and those are the things that may be seen, may not be seen out in the community. But all of these other things, not necessarily criminal behavior, but certainly are things used to keep that victim in check. Using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, using children, that is a big factor, using male privilege, using economic abuse, and coercion and threats. These all kind of work together to make sure that that power and control is maintained over that victim of domestic violence. And so this is just one of the tools, and it is a very handy tool to use for talking to victims of domestic violence, for training officers and other people in the system, especially when I was talking to victims when I was prosecuting cases. Oftentimes, once they saw this and they saw some of these things that are happening in their home show up on this wheel, they started seeing that, okay, maybe this is something that I need to get help with, since so many other people have gone through this. And there's a whole set of all kind of information and education about this particular process and this topic. So it's really important to kind of keep in mind that this is what victims are going through when they're making certain determinations about what they need to do. Not only is the power and control wheel one of the patterns, but another pattern is basically the continuum of violence. And that's the idea that things start small and they tend to escalate. And it happens for all the different types of violence that's here, talks about different things that may at first not seem like a very big deal, but ultimately can escalate into much bigger things. Verbal and emotional, for instance, it may just start out as name calling, often in the privacy of the home where there's no other witnesses, that then ultimately can go to yelling and intimidation. And then oftentimes the escalation into humiliation is what signals to the victim that, okay, now we have a batterer who does not care what other people may know about their relationship and what's going on, because they start doing these things out in public in front of their friends and families. And so that often is a big signal that this is an escalating situation. Not only does this escalate, so does the physical aspect of this. And often it will start as something small, again, a push, something relatively minor, that can ultimately happen, and this may go on for a while. And then as soon as that batterer feels that they're starting to lose control, they kind of up the power and the force that is used and go to punching, maybe hitting, maybe slapping, maybe kicking, different types of things like that, till ultimately it can escalate to murder. While people who are being pushed at this low-level Class C in Texas, Class C misdemeanor level, it doesn't always go all the way up to the murder level. I guarantee you, the folks who have been victims of domestic violence homicide, it did start for them at a lower level and then escalated over time. Again, it could have taken months, could have taken years, but it starts out small and gets bigger. The same with sexual violence. Starting small, going bigger, may just be objectification of that person. Then ultimately unwanted touching. Basically treating that person as, you are my property. I will do what I want to do. Oftentimes this would continue even after the relationship has ended. I had many cases when I was prosecuting that would be victims who would have to be in contact with the abuser for exchange of the children. Maybe they would be dropping the kids off at their house, and then that person would decide, to go ahead and touch or grope in an unwanted manner and be able to send that message that, hey, I still can do whatever I want to do, until ultimately it does escalate into forced sex, which happens regardless of whether or not they are still in a relationship. But it is the ultimate way to show that I have the ultimate power and control over you and what you want. While I know I am not alone in wishing I had some magic crystal ball to help me know whether or not this is a victim of domestic violence that I am trying to assist, there are some things that we can look at that will tell us whether or not the lethality of this situation is something that we need to really be worried about. One of those things is the fact that there's prior family violence. 72% of domestic violence homicide, according to a national study, showed that prior family violence did occur between these individuals. Another incident of lethality that can be looked at is stalking. 76% of female domestic violence victims were stalked in the year prior to their murder by the intimate partner that killed them. So those are really big indicators that this is a serious situation that may warrant protective orders and extra help to make sure that we're trying to keep that victim safe. Some other important factors that increase someone's chances of becoming a victim of domestic violence homicide include threats, increases those chances almost 15 times. Use or threats to use a weapon increases those chances by 20 times. Strangulation, if there's been prior attempts at strangulation, it will increase those chances by almost 10 times. And forced sex will increase those chances by almost 8 times. And jealousy, extreme jealousy, not casual jealousy, but instances of extreme jealousy, which is often mentioned from victims of domestic violence, it will increase those chances by over 9 times. So these are some other really important things that why we have to be asking about, no matter what our role is, if we are in a capacity to ask specifically, what are some of the other things that have been going on in this pattern before you got to this point, because those things will show us what are some of the more serious cases that we need to really look at assisting by providing safety, providing protective orders, and other information so that those people can be safer. Now, one of the questions that we're always thinking about, what is the overall impact? And actually, UT Austin did a study back in 2011 about the statewide prevalence of intimate partner violence in Texas. And there were several things that were asked. There was a lot of details, but one of the overall questions was, have you ever experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence in your lifetime? And ultimately, this is what the answers were. Nearly 32% of all Texans experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Now, almost a third of us. If you're female, that's almost 38%. If you're male, it's almost 27%. So when you're looking at it and you're looking at the overall population, that's 5.3 million people back in 2011 that talked about this. Now, keep in mind, This particular survey asked, have you experienced it? Not, did you perpetrate it, or were you a victim of it, or did you act in self-defense? Not specifically those things, just have you experienced it? So when you're looking at the overall impact, this is a really good picture so that we know exactly how much it impacts everybody. And almost all of us know somebody, maybe several somebodies, who have gone through this. And so there is a huge segment of the population that is dealing with this on a regular basis. As far as reported violence, the numbers from DPS, from their Crime in Texas report that just came out for 2013, talks about that there were 185,453 domestic violence incidents, and that is a 1.9% decrease from 2013. The interesting part, and I don't have the specific numbers on here, but from looking at that report, while the incidents went down, the actual number of offenders and the actual number of victims went up slightly. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, assault actually accounted for 97% of all reported domestic violence offenses. Of those assaults, simple assaults, which I have those in quotation marks because really there's no such thing as simple assault in the state of Texas. There's nothing that's called simple assault in the penal code, but this is how the Uniform Crime Report lays it out. It's going to be your low-level assaults, and it's about 74% of all reported domestic violence, of all assaults. Aggravated assault was about 15%, a little over 15%, and intimidation was about 7%, and those are going to be like the threats type cases, terroristic threats. While these DPS numbers are pretty big numbers, they sound pretty big, and they are pretty big, they're actually just the tip of the iceberg, because the great majority of domestic violence and sexual assault by non-strangers goes unreported completely. There was a report that was funded by the DOJ, the Department of Justice, in which it stated that victims actually reported about 15% of the time, third parties about 8% of the time, which is normally going to be children, maybe neighbors or bystanders, which leaves a whopping 76.9% that are unreported. There are several different reasons why they are unreported, but among some of the reasons, this is not all of them, but just some of them, victims thought they were too minor. That's why they didn't report. They were embarrassed. Fear of reprisals was definitely a big one. Police could not do anything about it, felt that the police would not do anything about it, or that they would not be believed. Now, these are just some of them. We cannot discount some really important issues. And again, the dynamics of domestic violence, you just want the violence to stop. You don't necessarily stop loving the person who is doing this to you. So many times they just don't want to also get that person in trouble in any way. So there's a lot of different reasons why people don't report. Now, discussing types of injuries from the DPS numbers that we talked about a minute ago, we talked about minor injuries, no injury, and major injuries. Minor injuries, 53%, no injury, 42%, and this little bitty slice right here of major injuries, only 5%. But when it talks to about minor injuries, we're talking about bodily injury, which can be pain, cuts, bruises, sometimes black eyes. It can have a lot of different types of injury. Then when it comes to major injury, we're talking about serious bodily injury. And those are going to be things that create a substantial risk of death or that causes death, serious permanent disfigurement or protracted loss of or impairment of the function of any bodily member or organ. So a lot of things can happen before you get to the point of serious bodily injury. So it's important to keep in mind that those types of injuries are out there, and that there are a lot of things that happen that do not necessarily wind up involving visible injuries, at least not at the time that a police officer is reporting to the scene of the crime. This chart does not reflect incidences where it was later determined through medical attention that there were greater injuries or less injuries. It just was at the time that the report was made. But one thing really we do have to keep in mind about injuries. Remember, Experienced batterers know how to hit without leaving immediate or subsequent injuries many times. They strike in the swimsuit area, which is basically the torso area, because that's where our clothes are. You can't see that, and most people are not going to voluntarily reveal that much of their bodies to complete strangers, even officers, or at least especially officers. Striking in the scalp area, often in the hairline, there will be bumps, there will be lacerations, things like that, but you can't really see it because of the hair. So many people, that is where they would incur a lot of their injuries. In fact, when I was prosecuting these cases, oftentimes it would be a sign to the victim that the violence is escalating, because maybe they had been on the receiving end of many assaults where they only were struck in the swimsuit area or in the head, where you couldn't see the injuries. But as soon as they started hitting in the face or in other parts of the body that other people could see, to them that was a sign that, okay, this person now does not care if people see my bruises and understand and know that it's coming from him. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, that sometimes that's a trigger of the escalation of violence when that changes. Another thing to keep in mind is that what looks minor at first can definitely change over the next few days. So, for example, what looks like this today, this is a bite mark, and yes, you can see it, but it doesn't look like a whole bunch at this point. It look like this tomorrow. And what may start out like a minor grabbing today might look like this tomorrow. So these are all things that we have to think about. And unfortunately, by the time a lot of this bruising shows up, many victims of domestic violence, because they are in that cycle and they're oftentimes in denial about what's going on, or they're not sure what to do, or they're scared to do something, in that first day is when a lot of those decisions are made, either not to follow up, not to prosecute. So they're not going to go out of their way to document injuries, go to the doctor, photograph injuries, anything like that. So that's why often these injuries will go unseen. And unfortunately, that is something that is kind of the nature of this particular beast, because it is so insidious and it is so possible to cover it up, or at least try to cover it up, because of the cycle and the dynamics of domestic violence itself. So it is just something really important to kind of keep in mind no matter what we're looking at. But that is why it's really important, again, in the words of Casey Gwynn, we must make our misdemeanors matter. We must realize that true success is not prosecuting a murderer, it is preventing the murder. And that is absolutely true. This is truly homicide prevention. Whenever I train anybody, misdemeanor prosecution, responsible, good, thorough misdemeanor prosecution is homicide prevention. So is a very intuitive, meticulous protective order type of practice, because we are looking at trying to stop it from escalating. It doesn't help to do it after somebody's already dead. Yes, we may, retribution or accountability, however you want to look at it. However, it's much more important to prevent the murder. In 2012, there were 114 Texas women that were killed by intimate partners, and that was 10% of all homicides that happened in Texas. And the counties that are listed in the right-hand corner on the map in white are where all of those murders occurred. Plus, there were 15 bystanders that were killed, including 5 children. Plus, there were 44 perpetrators who were killed because their situations involved murder-suicide. So they killed themselves after they killed their intimate partner. There were 61 witnesses. They weren't killed, but that witnessed the incidents, 44 of whom were minor children, and 60% of these were committed with firearms. The source for this is the Texas Council on Family Violence. They put out a report every year called Honoring Texas Victims. And if you go to their website, which is tcfv.org, you'll see other prior reports for prior years, and actually probably any time now, I would imagine the 2013 numbers will be out. So it is definitely worth looking at. So you see kind of what the patterns have been and what's been going on the horizon of domestic violence homicides in Texas. Unfortunately, there is a similar mistrust of the civil justice system, in which victims can go and apply for protective orders. They don't trust the system because they don't think anyone's going to believe them. And sometimes they have reason to feel that way, of all the different things that they hear about, maybe from friends, family, the media, whatever. And they often lack objective evidence of this allegation and don't always present well in court. Unfortunately, we are currently in the aftermath, at the time of this recording, of the Ray Rice incident, in which he assaulted his fiancée and knocked her out in an elevator, and it was all captured on video. Most of the time there is no video. Most of the time it happens beyond any type of sight of anyone or any kind of video cameras. So it becomes an issue that they fear they are not going to be believed, and unfortunately it seems like the video is what triggers the most response, but it just doesn't happen. So then often protective orders are denied, or batterers will get custody or unsupervised visitation because of this lack of evidence. So victims will respond in ways to best protect themselves and their children, not always in conformity with whatever the orders from the court are. And so they wind up getting punished or lack their legal protection that they need because they haven't followed the court orders. Because victims understand that if they are being battered, that oftentimes, in at least half the cases, sometimes more, batterers will often move on to the children in the home, in many cases more than half of the time. And so they have very real fears for the safety of their children. So then ultimately victims are not safe and offenders are not held accountable, so then they don't trust the system and they don't access it. And this is from Tracy Grinstead Everly of Texas Council on Family Violence. Thank you, Tracy. So, back to why do we care about protective orders and TCIC reporting? The bottom line is protective orders that cannot be verified will often not be enforced. Many officers, while it would be nice if just a copy of the protective order would be enough, many times they want to be able to feel comfortable enough to enforce it by seeing in their system that it's actually there. But unfortunately, when it's not there, it compromises both safety and accountability. And so then you wind up with neither. And so that becomes a huge problem. When it comes to victims, they become unprotective and suffer further abuse in many cases. Sometimes they have a copy of the protective order or was given one, but it was taken and destroyed by the batterer. That type of behavior is not at all uncommon. I've had many situations where mail is taken, doing everything they can to make sure that that victim doesn't have any of the important documentation they need to protect themselves. Sometimes they have not yet received a copy from the issuing court. Let's say it was a magistrate's order of emergency protection and it was just issued 5 hours ago, and now this person is out on bond, and yes, now they have a protective order, but if they are going back over to the house to cause more problems, which happens sometimes, then if the victim doesn't have a copy of it, then they don't have anything to show the officer. So it becomes that much more important for the officer to be able to look through their official systems to find this protective order and what it entails. Law enforcement officers are also put in danger. I think it would be very important for an officer who has to make some sort of in-person contact with someone, whether it be through a traffic stop or otherwise, and know that this is a person where a judge has made a determination that they are a danger to someone, because oftentimes they are dealing with someone who might be on the way to go over and cause harm to the victim. But they don't know that the officer doesn't know that, and so they respond in a way that is not safe for officers. And also the community. It is not uncommon, and we've all heard of incidents where the incident may occur or the protective order may occur, and then once the incident happens, then it kind of spills out into other parts of the community. They go to public places, they go to workplaces, they do different things in order to basically make that victim pay. And sometimes it's a matter of, I'm going to take as many people with me as I possibly can. And so it's another important thing for the community. As far as accountability, violations go unpunished, and the more people violate orders and violate the law and that goes unpunished, then there is no accountability, and it tends to make that behavior escalate. And it does increase the opportunity for the offender to retain and or procure firearms under state and federal law, because if no one knows that this order is there and doesn't realize that this person is not supposed to have a firearm, then it's easier for that to happen and to kind of skirt around the background checks that have been put into place. So on the topic of safety and protective orders, people often talk about, one of the comments that I usually hear is, hey, it's a protective order. It's just a piece of paper. Yeah, you're right. I get it. It is just a piece of paper. The last time I checked, paper is not bulletproof. It is not made of Kevlar. However, it can be a piece of the puzzle when it comes to intervention in domestic violence cases. Certainly it has to be taken in conjunction with the other things that happen, the prosecution, the advocacy, the safety planning, all of those things. But it also can give some peace of mind. And actually there was a report that was done, put out by the Carsey Institute, where they did a study in 2011. And there is the link to the actual report if you want to read it. And for 50% of victims who had a protective order, the protective order actually stopped the violence, or at least the violence stopped after the protective order was issued. And then for the other half of victims who had a protective order, the violence was significantly reduced. Now, some other parts of that study talked about how there was a weakness in this, and that was the enforcement, especially in rural areas. And some of the problems that was cited in rural areas was that there were some difficulties with law enforcement determining predominant aggressor. Whether or not that was a training issue or an inclination issue, I do not know. Some of the other issues were that there were fewer resources. Obviously, if you live 2 or 3 counties away from where there are places to go for help or shelters or advocacy or to get a protective order or whatever, then that is certainly going to have an impact. And also, the last one is if there are local politics. If you're living in a small town, if you've ever lived in a small town, you know that the chances of everybody knowing everybody and knowing everybody's business, that always has a bit of an impact on whether or not you're going to have some impartial type decisions that are made if everybody knows everybody. And so those things definitely had an impact as well. So those are just some of the extra things to kind of think about in terms of that. So next on our list on why do we care about protective orders in TCIC is federal funding. Federal funding may be reduced. Under the NICS Act Record Improvement Program, which is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, it requires states to report all Brady disqualifiers to the federal criminal databases. Now, a Brady disqualifier is something that is someone's history that will stop them from having a firearm actually transferred to them. Those disqualifiers include felony convictions, misdemeanor convictions of domestic violence, mental health commitments, and protective orders. So we keep in mind that those things need to be tracked properly so that certain funding isn't dealt with in a negative manner. So another aspect of the funding is that if we are in compliance with the Brady disqualifiers and making sure those are being properly tracked, the state may actually be eligible to receive a waiver of the 10% match requirement for certain federal grants. And if you've had anything to do with grants, whether it be writing or administering or documenting or anything like that, you know that it is a very good thing to not have to worry about match requirements. So that's definitely a thing to shoot for. Otherwise, if we're not in compliance, the state's burn justice assistance grants, which fund the criminal justice system projects at the state and local levels, may be reduced. For example, that's a pretty big chunk of the pie. In 2013, the Office of the Governor in Texas received over $21 million in burn grant funds. So on the one hand, we want to make sure we're doing it for safety. We want to make sure our own funding is going to be intact, but we also don't want to put the funding of the whole state in jeopardy. So as much as we are always looking for more resources to help victims, especially in the judiciary and in the justice system, it's really a good thing to be able to make sure that these things are happening to ensure that we are getting as much help as possible. Finally, another reason we want to care about this is research. It's really difficult to make determinations and do certain things if we have inaccurate information in the state and national databases. So it's really important that what we have is accurate info. Otherwise, there is an inability to identify areas of need. If we don't know that certain things happen over in certain jurisdictions, as far as the incidents that occurred, the type of intervention that happened, and whether or not that was useful or not useful, it makes it much, much harder to allocate resources to those areas. So research is another really good and important reason that we want to make sure that TCIC reporting is happening properly. Now on to the what portion of our program, the first of which is what I call the alphabet soup. And that is all the acronyms of all the different systems that we're talking about. The first one is TCIC, which is the Texas Crime Information Center, which is accessed via the Texas Law Enforcement Telecommunications System, or TLETS. It provides responses within 12 seconds and links to NCIC so that Texas law enforcement officers know instantly about stolen property, wanted persons, or protective orders anywhere in the country, not just within Texas. The next one is III, which stands for the Interstate Identification Index, and it is the Federal Criminal History Database. The National Crime Information Center is NCIC, which is basically the national version of TCIC. And NICS is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which checks available records in NCIC, III, and the NICS index to determine if prospective transferees are disqualified from receiving firearms. The other part of the what portion of our program talks about what types of protective orders in Texas should be getting entered into the TCIC system. First of all, for family violence, under the Texas Family Code, a temporary ex parte order, which is under Chapter 83, and that is the type of order that a judge will issue in preparation for an upcoming hearing on a permanent protective order. And those are criminally or civilly enforceable. Also, the permanent protective order, and that is what is determined at that hearing whether or not there can be a permanent order and how long is it going to be. It can be any length of time. Usually it's about 2 years. It can actually be non-expiring depending on the situation, and that is found in Chapter 85 of the Texas Family Code. The other type of order under the Code of Criminal Procedure is 17.292, and that is a magistrate's order of emergency protection. And what happens is the order can be granted once someone is arrested for certain offenses, and that judge makes that determination before that person is released from custody, and with certain conditions, and again, those are criminally enforceable. The other type of order are trafficking, sexual assault, or stalking protective orders, and while they are actually provided for under the Code of Criminal Procedure, Article 7A. It's actually a civil order that is handled in much the same way that the temporary ex parte and the permanent protective order for family violence under the Family Code would. At first glance, the process for entry of the protective order into TCIC looks pretty straightforward. It starts with a court, which issues the protective order, and the court clerk will then send the protective order and the completed data entry sheet to the police department, and that will be either the local municipal police, if they live within the municipality, or to the sheriff of that county if that person lives out in the county and not in a municipality. Then the law enforcement agency enters that protective order information, so that's going to be the conditions of the order, identifying information for the protected persons, stay away locations, and respondent into DPS protective order database, which is TCIC. So upon further inspection, when you think about it, how many participants are there in this process? In other words, how many cooks are in this particular kitchen, and how many different ways can it go sideways? And that's a really important question when you start looking at all the people. You're looking at people who have information and furnish it to others. You look at people who do the paperwork or the documentation based upon that information. And you also look at some of the participants that do both, that gather information and also do the documentation and then have to send it someplace else. So just for protective orders, that could be the victim. If they talk to the police, it would be the officer who makes the report. If they don't talk to the police, it might be an advocate or an attorney, and that could be with any number of legal advocacy agencies, shelter agencies, legal aid, that type of thing. Could also be a county or district attorney's office. That information then gets filed with the county or district clerk's office, who has to do certain things to it, including making a setting, helping get this information to the judge, who makes a determination on the ex parte order, and then that order comes back and gets filed with the district or county clerk's office. Then it goes to the clerk who actually works within that judge's courtroom, who handles the paperwork, gets it, makes sure it gets to the judge. The judge does whatever they're going to do with it if they issue the order, making sure everything is written in the order. And then it goes back to the court clerk, who then sends it back to the district or county clerk's office, who then has to, among other things, send to the police or sheriff's office for purposes of the TCIC data entry. And then that data entry has to happen, and normally that's going to happen within that agency, but it's going to be usually dispatch staff or communication staff who wind up doing that data entry. Now, for magistrate's orders of emergency protection, it's really not much better. Again, you have the victim. In this one, you will have an officer, because a MOEP can only be given after someone has been taken into custody and before they are released from that custody. So there will be an officer. But there might be an advocate that they talk to, or an attorney as part of this process. Then it goes to the court clerk of that magistrate court. And then it goes to a judge, and then it goes back to the court clerk. Sometimes, but not always, it will go to a district or county clerk, which is probably a really good idea to do to make sure it's actually getting entered into the main county system. To the police department, who then, again, gives it to their data entry staff, who's normally going to be the dispatcher. So that's a lot of different people that have to touch this before they are able to move on. So, just based upon a cursory inspection of all the different places and all the different people that are involved in this process, OCA started looking at some federal funding, and we were able to get federal funding from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in which we started the Protective Order Record Improvement Project. And the goal of this project is to increase the reporting of protective orders to NICS by reviewing and analyzing the process from application or request stage to the entry into TCIC, because it was becoming apparent that not all protective orders were making it into the system. So we met with law enforcement, judicial, and court clerk training organizations. Some of you may be listening. We also conducted case studies in 8 rural, suburban, and urban jurisdictions. We went all over Texas. We were in Eagle Pass. We went up to Fannin County. We were down in Galveston. Went out to Lubbock. We did Tarrant County and Travis County and Lampasas County. We tried to get different places, different sizes, so we can get different ideas. And we talked to all the different players in that organization, in that jurisdiction, whether or not it was court clerks, judges, law enforcement, municipal judges, magistrates, advocates, attorneys. We just tried to talk to everybody so we can get a sense of what everybody's issues were and what ideas they may have to improve the situation. We also, and some of you who are listening, might have received our statewide survey, and we had great response to the survey. We were amazed at how many people responded with a lot of really good information and requests for more training. So if you were part of that, thank you for that. We also created the NICS Protective Order Improvement Task Force to develop recommendations on what we could do to improve the process, but also to improve and conduct training on these issues. And then now we're in the process of developing the training to improve the reporting rates. And the first step is doing these webinars so that we can make sure that information that we got are sharing with other people. So right off the bat, many of the big picture obstacles were identified, and they were identified by just about everybody that we talked to, no matter what their role was in this process. First one is Texas has a hugely decentralized court and law enforcement system, or rather several systems, 254 counties, 458 district courts, 510 county level courts, so that will be constitutional county courts and county courts at law, 817 justice courts, 926 municipal courts with 1,288 judges, and then 2,636 law enforcement agencies. And of course, everybody does it a little bit differently. So that was identified first off, and that's pretty much what we knew going in. Many people discussed that they were, by the time they got data entry sheets, regardless of what their role was, they didn't get full data sheets, or there was missing information or completely missing data sheets, so they weren't getting them at all. Most folks were unaware of the other participants' roles in this process, like how they could do things to facilitate what other people are doing, and also just a lack of regular communication. They may have known who they could contact in other agencies, or they maybe didn't know. So that was one of the things that came up. Other big picture problems, lack of standard forms and orders. Unfortunately, different jurisdictions, they do different types of orders. Sometimes they get an order and it doesn't really look like a protective order. And the same with TCIC data entry forms. There is a basic one that's online, but sometimes different agencies do different things and want to adjust it a little bit. Also, there was also no confirmation procedure that the order was received by law enforcement. Again, some agencies did this, others did not, so they didn't know for sure that it got received. There was lack of personnel to assist victims with the application. Sometimes being able to just have someone walk through the application with that victim and lay out what needs to go into it helps a lot. But if you just hand it to that victim, then it becomes a problem. Insufficient police investigation and documentation. Again, police reports. And whenever I train police officers, that's the big thing. Report, document, 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 put everything in there, ask lots of questions, because all of that becomes really important no matter what happens with this particular case. There was some mention of typographical errors during data entry. Some people had kind of a measures in place to make sure that the person who did it correctly, so there were no typos. Other places did not have that, and there were some instances that were brought to our attention where someone was arrested because what was done in the protective order as far as an expiration date was incorrect, when actually that order had expired, but the expiration date that was showing in TCIC was different, that type of thing. Lack of understanding of the Brady indicator. You will recall a few slides earlier we talked about Brady and how we needed to know if, that there were a mental health commitment or a protective order, those types of things on someone's history. However, many of the data entry people talked about that they really didn't understand how it worked. They didn't have a whole lot of training on it, so they didn't do it at all. They didn't use it at all. And unfortunately, that is one of the big things it's important to know. Is this person eligible to have a firearm or not? Because NICS wants to make sure that when those background checks are done, that they are able to say definitively, can this person have a firearm or not? Not just, we don't know, so we have to let them have it. So that was another issue. Now, specifically, district and county attorney's offices, they identified a couple of different challenges over and above what we have talked about, and that is confusion among agencies regarding who should actually enter the order. Now, under the law, it should be the agency where that complainant or victim lives. Now, if they live in the municipality, it should be the police department. If they live out in the county, it should be the sheriff's office. Now, there's been some confusion as to exactly how that should work. And so sometimes we have the situation where nobody's entering it because they're not sure who should enter it. And I think a best practice in that area is going to be, we don't really care who enters it, just get it entered. Because again, that ups the safety for officers, the community, and the victims. Also, there was a little bit of issue discussed that law enforcement agencies may not accept an order if the applicant's address is undisclosed. They want to be able to put an address in there. And so that becomes a confidentiality issue, and really what confidentiality means. Does it mean that if it's confidential from the public for, public information access, does that mean it should also be confidential from law enforcement? So again, that is something that can be spelled out a little clearer in the orders themselves. Top recommendations from these offices: mandatory statewide forms. Again, this is something that almost everybody talked about. Wanted mandatory statewide forms so everybody's forms looked the same and they knew exactly what it was going to be. Of course, the big question is going to be, what forms are we going to use? And that is going to be something we will have to look at after we kind of go through this process, and we're looking at other things to change and adjust so that we can make those types of recommendations. Another top recommendation was to add fields in TCIC for the types of protective orders. Many people talked about it would probably be really good if at first glance, without having to go through all of the actual conditions, an officer can identify immediately in the field what that protective order is for. Is it for family violence, sexual assault, trafficking, stalking, anything like that? Now, in our discussions with victim advocacy and legal aid groups, their top challenges were private attorneys were unaware of the process and the importance of complete and accurate TCIC forms. They were worried that victims, while maybe they would receive protective orders, the orders wouldn't actually get entered, and there were some incidents where they know of that has happened. Another one was that they were unable to verify temporary ex parte orders, which they are supposed to be able to be entered into TCIC, but apparently were not being done. And so they have frustration when they are not able to verify that. And also, if they're not in the system, they're a little bit harder to verify and be enforced by law enforcement. Staff turnover in other agencies was a problem, especially in law enforcement. Now, their top recommendations, which I think this one was a really good one, a creation of a portal, which is similar to the child support portal, to enable victims, attorneys, and others to see what information has been sent and to allow easier portability. Another one is to require the filing of the TCIC data sheet up front, like the civil case information sheet, and require the entry of ex parte orders after receiving proof of service. And also to have uniform filing procedures statewide, especially in situations where you have legal aid groups or victim advocacy groups that maybe they deal with several counties and every county does it differently. And so it becomes problematic when they're trying to figure out what they need to do, and having that consistency across the different jurisdictions would definitely make things easier pretty much on everybody. District, county, and court clerks had some of the same types of recommendations. They talked about some of the challenges being private attorneys not completing TCIC forms, and also other agencies not completing TCIC forms, so they had lots of extra follow-up they needed to do before they could forward this information to law enforcement. In addition, they talked about confusion regarding which jurisdictions should be performing the data entry. Some of the recommendations was a mandatory updated statewide form including a checklist, a web link to OCA for tip sheets, forms, and other information, which is something I'm going to be working on. TCIC data entry fields should include the type of the protective order, and getting or confirming all TCIC information when the parties are in court. So regardless of who you are, if you're in court and you've got the parties in front of you, confirming, is this still good information? Has there been updated information? Do you have extra information? And that can be by the judge, by the clerk, by the attorneys, anybody who is there who is dealing with the parties. Also, they recommended a procedure to double-check data entry for typographical errors. And again, this is something that many law enforcement jurisdictions do. Some did not. And they have certain things in place, like maybe another person who's on shift with them goes and checks it before it actually gets officially entered. Or another jurisdiction had it so that the next shift checked the shift before the data entry that they did to make sure that everything was in there properly. Judges had several issues as well, many of which we've already discussed. A lot of this stuff was shared by judges. One of their challenges, though, that they identified was law enforcement doesn't understand the order, especially MOEPs. And while this is not necessarily an issue with data entry, it certainly is an issue with making sure that things are being enforced properly. And so that's always an important thing. Another challenge was the inconsistencies regarding confidential location of the applicant. How was that handled? Is that confidential from everyone, or is it just confidential from public information? It would make sense that that is something that should not be confidential from law enforcement, because law enforcement needs to know. But by the same token, it certainly is something that a judge would be able to confirm and clarify in their order how they want that handled. Another question was handling the extensions of orders after violations or incarceration. After there is a violation of protective order, it can be extended, and also can be extended if someone is incarcerated, extended to 1 year past when they get released, but there is really no set way to make sure that everyone is aware of those extensions. And so that was certainly something they were concerned about. And also concerned about high turnover in law enforcement. Their top recommendations, again, they were very much on board with statewide mandatory standard forms, including adoption by the state bar for private practitioners, compliance mechanisms such as the 90% CGIS requirement as they have for the mental health records. Law enforcement had a lot of obstacles and a lot of recommendations, which makes sense because they are the ones at the end of the process that are dealing with what did or did not happen toward the beginning of the process. So the top challenges identified was missing forms, incomplete data, or conflicting information between the forms and the actual protective order, failure to receive the order, confusion regarding out-of-state orders, who validates those out-of-state orders, who modifies those orders, those types of questions. Delayed receipt of protective orders from the clerk's office if it is done by mail. Lack of timely notification when a protective order is extended or modified. So it may get extended by the court or modified by the court, but they don't get enough notification to get that taken care of quickly. And who enters the order if they cannot determine the address of the applicant. Now, their top recommendations, they definitely want training on Brady indicator for data entry personnel. They would like to have a deadline for the clerks to forward to the entering agency, and also to require a new TCIC data sheet to be forwarded to the entering agency whenever there is a renewal or an extension of the protective order. They would also like to require that TCIC data sheet accompany the order at the time of filing. Some places did it toward the end of that process. Some jurisdictions did it at the beginning of the process, and everybody seems to be in agreement that doing that at the front end is usually the best way to make sure that everything is getting taken care of. This is, just for reference, what the protective order data entry form looks like. And it is kind of a beast, as you can tell. I'm not expecting you to read all of that. If you want to look at it, here is the link to it on our website. But it has a lot of information that is very detailed. It needs to be looked at and taken care of carefully whenever those orders are filed. Okay, moving on to big picture recommendations. And these are recommendations that were made by almost everyone that we spoke to, regardless of what their role was. First big one, everybody seems to want mandatory, uniform, statewide forms. I can certainly see how that would be helpful. And I think it's something that we can kind of look at in order to try to make that happen, because it would definitely streamline the process for a lot of folks. Training of all participants, and it was interesting because oftentimes when people talk about training, they're talking about oh, we're doing a great job over here, but those folks over there, they need some training. And yes, there was some of that. However, a lot of the people that we talked to, we're talking about them, they themselves wanted more training. And specifically, they wanted to make sure that that training included the dynamics of family violence, the different types of protective orders, and the importance of information gathering, and that process and kind of how people go about that. Some other recommendations, including some legislative changes. One was having a deadline for clerks to send the order to law enforcement. Right now, there is no such deadline. Also, to mandate the entry of magistrates' orders of emergency protection into TCIC. Right now, the way the Code of Criminal Procedure is written, Article 17.292, specifically, it talks about entry, but it's done in a very permissive way, that an agency may order or have protective orders entered in a system that would normally notify officers of warrants. It's a very general type language, as instead of how it is in the family code for permanent protective orders, a very specific thing that they will actually be mandated into the TCIC system. And so that is a change that was recommended. Also clarifying which agency should enter the order if the victim's current address is unknown. Sometimes by the time we get to the stage where the order has been sent to law enforcement, by then that victim may not be in that jurisdiction anymore for various reasons, sometimes for obvious reasons. But either way, we often think that, okay, if there's a change in this process where if it's the victim's address or last known address would actually kind of streamline that process a little bit more, so you don't have the, okay, well, I don't know who's supposed to enter it, so no one winds up entering it. So that's what we want to try to avoid. Another big picture recommendation was a statewide requirement to provide completed TCIC data entry form at the time of the application or at the time of the request. So application if it's a permanent protective order, for the request if it's a request by an officer to a magistrate under a MOAB, to try and make sure that that form is done at that time and not at a later time, because sometimes they just don't wind up getting done. And certainly one of the big things that came up from everybody was improving that communication among agencies. Everybody really wants to know more what's going on. They want to streamline the process. They want to help streamline it for others, and they certainly want it streamlined for themselves. So this communication piece is really, really important to everybody that we talk to. Some more big picture suggestions. We're talking to other participants involved in the process. Again, that communications piece. And it could be going to local agency meetings. If you don't already have them, make them. Maybe not monthly, maybe quarterly. Get together and talk about it. Think about all the people that are involved in that chain of information and get those people involved. These are certainly meetings that judges can be involved in. If it's about the administration of justice and court administration and streamlining processes, that is certainly something that judges can and should be involved in, as much as or more than even clerk's offices, law enforcement, attorneys, prosecutors, all of those folks. And having that input from your advocacy groups will definitely help. Share your contact list. I've talked to some people who had no idea how to reach somebody across the street to find out who do they need to talk to if they had a question. So get together, share those lists, have those phone numbers and those email addresses. Meet for breakfast. Just get together and talk about it over tacos. Who cares, as long as you're talking. Finding out the full process for your jurisdiction, not just what it is in your agency. Find out what happens before it comes to you and what happens after it leaves you. Expediting the process by sending an electronic copy or fax of the protective order and the forms to the reporting agency whenever possible. This is something that I highly encourage, because it will speed up that process. And according to the NCIC operating manual, each record in the protective order file must be supported by a protection order, and it can be an electronic or hard copy. Just make sure that you have one of those things, and so it can be sent. Obviously, if you're going to do it electronically by email, or if you're going to make attachments or anything like that, make sure that your procedures and your policies in your jurisdiction allow for the proper security levels to make sure that that's a safe thing to do. But most places have what they need for encrypted information to get that done. Also, certified copies are also accepted by law enforcement per the Court of Criminal Procedure under Article 505. Prioritizing the protective order processing, basically making it a priority. Many jurisdictions, though not all, as soon as a protective order came in, whoever saw it, grabbed it, and they got on it and got it taken care of. Many people did not leave for that day until that was taken care of. Now, we're not talking about 100 a day. Thank goodness, even for the larger jurisdictions, I don't think. So that should not be too much of a problem, but it certainly should be happening. Even very large jurisdictions made sure that they had that process. Sometimes that's easier, but still it comes down to making it a priority. Obtaining the identifying information required by TCIC included as much as possible in the early part of the process. Distributing the protective order data entry form to the applicant when it's filed, confirming the data sheet information in court, and revising internal procedures to reduce the number of participants involved. There were some jurisdictions that I spoke to that maybe they would have it and it would show up first to a supervisor, and then it would go to a junior supervisor, and then it might go to somebody else before it actually landed on the person that was going to do whatever needed to happen to that particular order. And so being able to kind of look at your process and go, okay, how many hands really have to touch this, and how can we reduce the number of hands without reducing the effectiveness of what we're doing. Now, regardless of who it is that is sending the protective orders, if it's a magistrate court and the clerk from that court is sending it, or if it's the court clerk's office or the county clerk's or the district clerk's office, whoever it is, it's usually a really good idea to make sure that law enforcement is actually receiving the protective orders that are sent. So creating and completing a checklist or a cover sheet that you can send with the data sheet and the protective order that informs the agency that both items have been forwarded. So then that way, if your checklist says you've got this and this, and they look at what they received and it doesn't have both of those things in there, then they can call and say, hey, I got this, however, I'm missing a third page or whatever it may be. It's always a really good idea to make sure that that happens, because you don't want it to get lost and, Neverland, as tends to happen. Keeping a copy of the protective order data sheet in the court's file. If you're e-filing and you've got it, you're keeping it that way, great. If it's a situation where you're keeping a hard copy, great. But if something happens and somebody comes to you and says, hey, we need another copy of that order, you can go put your hands on it and do what you need to do to get that back to where it needs to go. Requiring confirmation of the receipt by the agency. A very good idea would be to make sure a person is confirming that, not just the fax machine sends you the little okay that says it went through. Not always reliable. Much better to have an actual person that you can send it to if you're doing electronic, who can send you back a signed confirmation that yes, we got it, or an email that says yes, we got it. That would be great. Either one would be really helpful. Also, it's not a bad idea to periodically compare the number of orders forwarded to the law enforcement in your county with the actual number of orders that DPS has in the system for your county. Some counties talk about, yes, we've been doing X number of protective orders, but then when you look on DPS, they're not listed. And so, it comes up as 0. So that kind of report can actually be requested at TCIC at dpstexas.texas.gov. And so it's there on your information. I would certainly suggest that you look into what you need to do to find out and get that type of report sent to you on a regular basis. Now, that being said, if anybody has any questions or concerns, I know there's a lot of information, and I know there's a lot of things that many folks want to talk about. This was pretty much an overview. There are going to be more specific trainings coming down the pike, but if between now and then you have a question, you have a concern, please feel free to contact me. This is my phone number, 512-936-6390. And my email address is kim.pachowiak@texascourts.gov. Thank you so much for your attention, and please let me know if I can do anything for you.